I have an amazing session right now, an amazing panel, and I want to introduce the moderator of this panel, Jim Lewis. He's a senior fellow at the Center of Strategic and International Studies. And Jim is going to introduce the amazing people that are going to participate in that panel. Jim, if you are here, the stage is yours.
This is actually going to be a good panel, so thanks for sticking around. Let me say, first of all, that this conference is one of the best you can go to, and so I'm always amazed, this is the second time I've been here, at how good it is, and I really appreciate the invitation. I think all the panelists do. Let me just say, multi-stakeholder innovation, cyber infrastructure, public-private partnership. Good, now that we got all the cliches out of the way, we can do some real work. We're going to do something a little different here. This is about norms to some extent. And there's a current effort, I think, in the academic world to have a norm for every letter in the alphabet. We won't do that either. But what we will do is get you some of the real participants who are involved in this activity. One of the things I've discovered in working in cybersecurity is that it's hard to get data, you all know that. And it's particularly hard to get data on policy. And so one of the best ways to do it is interviews. So I want you to think of this as a series of interviews with some of the real experts. And we're very fortunate to have with us today Carsten Geier, I'm reading his title, head of the Cyber Policy Coordination Staff, Federal Foreign Office, Germany. More importantly, he was the chairman of the recently concluded GGE. And you'll give him a round of applause when he walks on, but he really deserves it for putting a huge effort into this, this thing that just ended on Friday. So he's going to talk to us a little bit. Carsten, are you around? Where'd he go? Oh. Thanks for stopping by.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you to the organizers for having me here and still welcoming me. Although, as you might have heard, the GGE, the United Nations Group of Government Experts on Information Communication Technology in the context of international security, last Friday did not reach a consensus on a report. News travels fast, faster than the speed of light, because it has its own, bad news has its own laws of physics, apparently. Anyway, I want to make the point that while this past Friday, the 25 experts did not reach agreement on a consensus report, they still had some very important discussions, and they agreed on a number of elements, and they are worth retaining. So let me give you a little bit of background on where we were and what we did arrive at. So the mandate of this group was to study existing and potential threats in the sphere of information security, possible cooperative measures to address them, and how international law applies to the use of information and communication technology by states, as well as norms, rules, and principles of responsible state behavior, confidence-building measures, and capacity building. And then we were supposed to present a report to the General Assembly. As I say, despite some very substantial difficulties, members of the GGE, the expert group, managed to identify a large number of valuable points related to most elements of their mandate. So looking at existing and potential threats, experts have shared an understanding that ICTs, information and communication technologies, continue to provide immense opportunities. At the same time, these technologies, their development and their rapid adoption opens new risks, including the malicious use of ICTs by non-state actors and actors acting as proxies. These trends are continuing. Experts noted growing concern that malicious activity can actually disrupt or impair the general functionality of global ICT systems. And another new element, a new threat identified, was actions to undermine the security of data. The group also, no, not the group, the experts also voiced concerns about use of ICTs for terrorist and criminal purposes. So all these are new elements, new threats identified in this context. Looking at capacity building, the group commented, not the group, the experts commented on capacity building in the context of international peace and security, emphasized the importance to engage in such capacity building activities to contribute to an open, secure, stable, accessible, peaceful ICT environment, and offered concrete guidance to this end, identified a number of concrete measures that states can undertake, including awareness raising, promoting educational professional training activities, information sharing, and so on. And an important suggestion was that ICT security capacity building efforts should be integrated into national development policies. Experts also made very good progress on confidence building. They offered concrete measures for implementation at the national as well as the regional and international levels. At the national level, guidance offered was to include raising awareness among senior decision makers, identification of appropriate points of contact. Experts suggested standard incident severity schemas and encouraged related activities, including exercises. At the international and regional levels, ideas developed included templates and procedures to facilitate information requests between states about serious ICT incidents, activities on preventing, responding, and managing serious ICT incidents, dialogue with all relevant actors, exchange of good practices. Equally, GGE discussions saw a number of very helpful observations on binding norms, rules, and principles. So the experts have offered recommendations to support implementation of the voluntary non-binding norms of responsible state behavior that were presented in the 2015 report of the group of government experts. So these concrete recommendations include establishing national structures, policies, processes, and coordinating mechanisms necessary to facilitate careful consideration of serious ICT incidents and to determine appropriate responses, as well as ICT assessment or severity templates to evaluate and assess ICT incidents. Experts suggested a number of other points, such as procedures for official notification, protocols for official notification from one state to another, and they provided clarifications on how to respond to incidents affecting critical infrastructures, warning that states consider the potentially harmful effects of their ICT activities on the general functionality of global ICT systems. They offered valuable recommendations concerning the proliferation of malicious ICT tools and techniques, including on preventing non-state actors from conducting malicious ICT activities. The only parts of the GGE's mandate where consensus and progress was really missing concerns certain aspects of how international law applies to the use of ICT by states. A second aspect where that's not part of the formal mandates, but that also was difficult, was the discussion on how to take this process further in the United Nations. Experts shared the understanding of reaffirming the findings in the 2013 and 2015 reports on how international law applies to the use of ICTs by states. They had an intense exchange of views, which included consideration that as a response to an internationally wrongful act involving the use of ICTs, a state may yet consider the use of countermeasures or even making use of its inherent right to self-defense. Experts felt that on these issues and on the issue of how to apply international humanitarian law, further study is required, and that's why ultimately we did not agree on a consensus report. So the question is how to proceed from here. At the end of the deliberations, the overwhelming majority of experts in the GGE confirmed that they could work on the basis of a draft report put forward by the chairman, and that this text seemed ready for consensus with minor changes. The deliberations of the group have not been formally concluded. And this opens a variety of avenues which I, as the chairman of the group, am still exploring, including with the help and at the request of the United Nations High Representative on Disarmament. Jim, I think I'll stop it here, and I would very much enjoy having a discussion on how to take this process forward.
Great. Thank you, Karsten. Okay, so we're going to have a panel. They're old friends, so I'm not going to give you their bios. We're going to run a little bit over since the session right after lunch ran a little bit over, but we're going to try and pick it up. You guys aren't supposed to walk on until I introduce you. You know. Chris Painter, who's the coordinator for cyber issues in the Office of the Secretary of State. Thank you. And Paul Ash, the director of the National Cyber Policy Office, Department of the Prime Minister, and Cabinet, New Zealand. He paid you to do that, didn't he? Hey, I've known all these guys for years. This is going to be a good conversation, but we are going to pick up where Karsten left off, which is, has the 2010 process, we began this process of developing norms really about 7 or 8 years ago on a global basis. Has it reached its end? What do we do next? Do we need to think about a like-minded approach, as Tom Bossert said yesterday? And more importantly, do we need to think about how we build consequences into to people who do bad things? So we'll pick it up there, but Chris, do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you, Jim, and thank you, Karsten. And I join Jim in thanking Karsten for all of his hard work over the last year and chairing the group. The group didn't reach consensus on this important issue of how international law applies in cyberspace. And that's an important issue because I think this is an issue we've been talking about for over 10 years now. So it's not that the conversation isn't mature. There's just some countries who really don't want to reach the conclusion of how international law applies. And as my colleague who was our representative of the GG said, it's unfortunate because I think that might belie a belief that they want complete freedom of action. They don't want the structures that have brought us peacefully in the last 100 years to go forward to really apply to cyberspace in the way that could be a stabilizing factor. And so that's troubling. And the fact that that conclusion wasn't reached is not insignificant. And there's more work to be done there. I think we do need to continue to think about those issues, and we shouldn't abandon those. On the other hand, I think over the last several times, the 2013 report and 2015 report in particular, and further work in this session, we reached, I think, some really significant conclusions, and a lot of progress is made in terms of the rules of the road, the voluntary norms of behavior below the threshold of armed conflict, the kinds of confidence-building measures that help better transparency and dial down the risk of escalation and misperception, capacity building. There's been a lot of really good efforts, and particularly in terms of the norms that I've talked about. I think those are really important. So how do you go forward with this? Well, we have already been talking even beyond the GG. The GG is an important venue, but it's not the only venue. For instance, this year in the G7, the foreign minister's statement had, I think, a more fulsome explanation of how international law applies. In terms of norms, we've been trying to get other countries beyond even the 25 that were in this GG to really embrace this stability framework, international law, norms, and confidence-building measures, to embrace this because it really isn't just for the developed world or a small group of countries, it's really for countries around the world. And then, as you heard Tom Bossert and Rob Joyce say just yesterday, the idea of these norms, the idea of these rules of the road, is that they really set expectations for states in cyberspace. So the next step, in my view, is that we continue to work with like-minded countries around the world, and that like-minded group could be very large, to pursue affirmation of those norms, but then use them as the foundation for deterrence, so that we can band together collectively as countries who embrace those concepts against bad actors. People say, what's the use of norms? I've heard this argument, what's the use of norms when people violate norms? Well, people violate norms in the physical world. I think the Ukraine, for instance, the invasion of Ukraine is a good example of It doesn't mean we don't abandon norms just because they're violated in the physical world, and it doesn't mean we abandon norms because they're violated in the cyber world. But if we can get countries to agree and then work together to sanction transgressors using a whole range of different tools, our trade tools, our law enforcement tools, our diplomatic tools, and creating new tools, thinking of new consequences that we can work on together, sort of a flexible group of countries. That is, I think, where we're going next. It doesn't mean we don't do the continued work in multilateral bodies, but we need to also think of how we can band together as like-minded countries.
So I want you to leave with at least two thoughts. The first thought is, it wasn't clear from a lot of the earlier discussion, but states are the primary bad actors in cyberspace. And no non-state actor has the capability to launch the most damaging cyber attack. And when we think about espionage, it's clearly states. And when we think about cybercrime, there are one or two states that are in the lead in promulgating or using cybercrime as a tool for state power. So we're in a very different environment. What Karsten went through last week was a transitional moment in international negotiation on cybersecurity. And I think what we need to think about now is not only what did we do next, and I'm going to ask Paul this, how do we deal with a situation where we are in a kind of conflict, where we have people who are opponents, where they don't agree with us on, as Chris said, the rules and the structures that we put in place more than 50 years ago. So we're in a different environment. If you needed a break point to realize that, it happened last Friday. Paul, what do you do with these people?
Well, thanks, Jim. I think I'd preface my comments by saying there's the potential for, I guess, catastrophizing what happened last week. I think we're at somewhat of an inflection point in terms of how we think about state behaviour and how we operationalise the really good work that the two previous GGE reports delivered. First, the applicability of existing international law to online behaviour, and second, a relatively tightly focused group of norms. You know, the GGE was always up against it in terms of trying to deliver a consensus around norms, and I absolutely endorse your point that we get into difficulties where we start to have one for every letter of the alphabet. We even have a difficulty agreeing on whose alphabet to use, I guess, first off, if we're doing that. But in the absence of normative behaviour, norms become quite challenging when you start to get to a sort of panoply of different ideas. What that leaves us with, I guess, is two reports that really set out the basis amongst a small group of experts, and I think it's important to remember that, you know, we've gone from 15 to 20 to 25. We don't have a whole range of states having participated actively in that debate yet. I take my hat off to Karsten and the team at the German Foreign Ministry for actually broadening the ability of states that don't have members or didn't have members in that group to participate. From here, the question, I guess, is how do we take the good work that's been done there and elsewhere in the Global Conference on Cyberspace series and in a number of other discussions and try and actually operationalise those, see what they look like in practice. And in many respects, that will be what determines what normative behaviour looks like, because we'll actually start to put some boundaries around behaviour that is not normative, that is actually beyond the bounds of acceptability. That's going to require over time, I think, quite a lot of work amongst like-minded states, as Chris has suggested, perhaps broadening our thinking a little beyond the organisations or states we currently work with, but trying to work hard to understand where that core of common agreement is and then what kind of responses we have to push back at behaviour that actually is beyond the bounds of that. And you know, some of the most fertile discussion at the moment is in that question of what does deterrence look like in cyberspace, what do consequences look like in cyberspace. And there's a couple of points I'd make there. First, we're at a fairly early stage of that discussion. We know what bad behaviour looks like because we're starting to see it fairly regularly. We're really just starting to push at the bounds of what the responses to that look like. And the first assumption I think we need to challenge is the one that's quite commonly out there, which is that bad behaviour using cyber means necessarily means a response using cyber means. That, I think, would lead us down a real rabbit hole and into some particular challenges. It's quite heartening then to see a number of states, you know, starting to broaden the types of tools they have, diplomatic tools, economic sanctions, law enforcement tools. I think all states involved would probably also reserve the right to use of force if they need to use it, or to some of those cyber means. But we're really, I think, still at a very, very formative stage in this process, and it's important, looking back on the events of last week and at some of the other hiccups we've seen, to see them as just that, bumps in the road as we start to form, I guess, the kind of customary international law wrapped around a norms framework that will deliver outcomes.
And I want to come back to the issue of consequences for bad behavior, because one of the things that shapes opponents' calculation of risk is if you actually do something. So when the Soviets thought about the risks of tangling with the US, they remembered our actions between 1941 and 1945. But before we do that, you brought up, we've had a couple processes for international negotiation. One was the GGE. Whether that's over or not remains to be seen, but some of us felt even as early as 2015 that we'd kind of run the string out on that one. You have this London process. For me, the highlight was with The Hague, but it's always been, had difficulties grappling with the issue of how you would agree on norms, processes, penalties. What should take its place when we think about processes? And let me start with Karsten. What would you want to do? Do you need like-minded nations to get together? Sometimes people say, well, you always have to have the non-aligned movement or the G77 involved. But if you do that, you almost guarantee not getting anywhere. So what do you want to do next, Karsten?
Jim, it's a bit of the issue of squaring the circle. On the one hand, I believe that we are faced with a global issue because ICTs and the internet are global. And so you need security in the context of a global system. On the other hand, it's very, very difficult to build a consensus involving 193 countries. So you probably need some sort of a combination. I think you need bilateral work, you need regional and like-minded initiatives, but I do think that you also need some sort of a global process. I think you can engineer that. It's not a fundamentally difficult issue, but it takes a little bit of fantasy to do this. But I have to be very clear on this. I do not believe that you can simply set the global process, and the global process of choice for me is the United Nations. You can just set that aside and say we'll go with selected partners and allies only. We're very happy to work in regional and in like-minded contexts, but it can just not replace the global debate.
I don't know if we all agree on that, so let's see.
So I think it's a combination. I think, you know, of course you're going to have a global debate, and it's going to be very hard to reach consensus on every issue, especially when countries have vastly different views of how they treat cyberspace more generally, where they have different views of sovereignty and control over information. There are going to be some limits. But that doesn't mean that while that process is going along, or we're thinking about how that process should be, and that should be a consensus-driven process led by experts with a focused mandate, not some generally open-ended thing that is you know, majority rule sort of thing. That's not where we really make consensus here. But we have to work in the regional organizations. We have to work with like-minded. And particularly when I think about the deterrence aspect, the consequences aspect, that's where it's most important. We have gotten some good agreement on a set of norms out of the GG, and I'd say the last thing I want to do is create a norms factory where we're just inventing new and new norms. Yes, there may be things that are not covered because our imagination hasn't hit it, but I think we have a good set now. And that's been agreed, and I think countries are comfortable, and we need to expand the consensus. But when we start thinking about consequences, we have the consequences that Paul raised, and you raised, Jim, but we also think of creatively, how can we do things that are temporary and reversible that will shape the adversary, whoever the adversary is, shape their behavior, that we communicate to them and say, we're going to hold you accountable, and if you don't change your actions, just like you do in the physical world, we're going to keep doing whatever we're doing. And it's better if we do that collectively than alone. And collectively means, and this is a concept we've talked about and I've talked about for a little while, you can think of an analogy, not an exact analogy, an analogy to the Proliferation Security Initiative, where voluntarily countries come together, in that case to stop the transport of fissile material, but in this case to act against transgressors. Flexible, they don't all have to agree in every case, but they bring different capabilities to the table, and then start thinking creatively about what those consequences are. What are the things beyond the tool set we talked about that we can do to hold countries accountable. I think there's a lot of work to be done there, and productive work, frankly, in large group, like-minded, small group, like-minded, bilateral settings like the one we have with Israel, which is where I'm going right after this panel, and with other countries around the world. I think there's a lot of work we can do there.
Chris was being coy about who might be the bad guys. So let me do a quick rundown before Paul talks. For the United States and probably for the UK and maybe for some others, it's Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And for Russia, China, and Iran, and North Korea, it's the US and probably the UK. So there's clear lines in this space, and to some extent other people are unfortunately involved in it. In Germany's case, in New Zealand's case, I think some of the countries I named do have strategic objectives to inflict harm on you. So I don't know where that leaves us. Maybe, Paul, you want to pick that up? And then Karsten.
Well, by your list, Jim, thankfully it leaves Karsten and I among the good guys, which is a nice feeling.
And I thought about it.
I think the challenge here is to avoid leaping to hasty conclusions about how we actually take this work forward. And to, this isn't a binary choice between a multilateral approach or each to their own going forward. And if we look back at the lessons of history, whether we're in trade policy, for instance, or in security policy, it's taken us quite a while using a range of tools, whether they're multilateral, they're regional, bilateral, or whether they're just collective security tools with coalitions of the willing, to actually take the debate forward where we've had new types of threat to grapple with, or in the trade arena where we've had to actually work our way bit by bit through some of the complications of trade policy. And I think there's something in that. We should be looking to build as many tools into our toolkit as possible as we take that forward. There are some caveats I'd place around that, though. From my government's perspective, I certainly don't think we're in a position where we think we should be stepping forward into a negotiation of some form of treaty. We're some step back from that at the moment because we really are still trying to understand what a number of the main actors in this area are doing. We're still building that picture. We're still building a picture of what the capabilities of cyber activity are. And we could find ourselves actually, if we're not careful, locked into some pretty poor outcomes with unintended consequences if we push directly into that multilateral treaty space at the moment. So I think from our perspective, that discussion needs to continue, but stepping in there at the moment would not be a good place to go. That leaves us with a range of other discussions. There's been useful confidence building work going on in a number of regional organisations. We do that in the ASEAN Regional Forum with a range of partners. I know the OSCE has done the same. And again, that's illustrative of the challenge we have. Those early discussions in those fora tried to draw on confidence building measures from an earlier era and from earlier threats, and we pretty quickly found they didn't work. We needed to be looking for new solutions, and I suspect that will be best done by groupings of like-minded organisations and states coming together to really test the boundaries of the tools we have. The ones I've named are pretty traditional, but there may be others in the technical realm or elsewhere that we can start to pull together if we've got that core of countries working together. That's not to say we also I guess, disregard the need to reach out beyond the like-mindeds and actually have conversations around the points where we differ with other states as well. And that's going to be quite important to keep those communication channels open as we try to understand how we get to a better place of relative stability in cyberspace.
I just agree with Paul in the terms of some calls for global conventions in this space are binding conventions. The problem is some countries, and Russia and China are among them, this is something they've been advocating for over 15 years. And they've advocated for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is to do something I think as democratic societies we don't do, which is trying to control information. The information itself is a threat, not the attacks and the intrusions that we're worried about. So it's very dangerous to go down that road. It doesn't make sense. There's lots of other reasons it doesn't make sense. So we had to be cognizant of that. But I also say you can also build consensus from the ground up. So for instance, we reached an agreement with China not to steal our intellectual property for purposes of commercial, to benefit their commercial sector. After that, the UK reached an agreement, Germany reached an agreement, Australia just reached an agreement, Canada reached an agreement earlier this week. The G20 endorsed this. So you can build some of these norms from the ground up. The useful work of the GGE was getting some agreement among the P5 and other countries on things like don't attack the critical infrastructure of another country that provides services to the public absent wartime. Wartime, there's a different set of rules. But we can take that forward. We can take that forward in regional and bilateral agreements or arrangements.
I think all three of the countries here agree that the idea of a multilateral treaty, formal binding treaty or a global treaty, is at a minimum premature. But more importantly, I think we do have a little bit of a dispute about how do you make progress. So the idea of having discussions with on a global basis and with all countries, great idea. It's kumbaya for me. But if we're going to get agreement on enforcing norms or pushing norms, does it have to be like-minded? And Karsten, why don't we start with you on that one?
Jim, let me try to slightly change the tack here. Chris earlier talked about the consequences of norm violations or rule violations. And I think he's right that it's quite important among like-minded partners to agree on those. I would add, though, that you have to be quite clear in the understanding also on the other side what the rules are that should not be violated, and B, what the consequences are. The problems, this is getting us into the issue of deterrence. The problem with deterrence by retaliation, which is a traditional narrow definition of deterrence. Deterrence by retaliation doesn't necessarily work terribly well in cyber because the offender always hopes that he can hide behind the attribution problem. That's why you've come to a wider concept of deterrence where cyber is concerned, where you also include issues not only of deterrence by denial, but also of entanglement and even of taboo. But this means for this kind of deterrence to work, you really need to have a clear understanding with the other side on what the rules are, and you cannot reach that by just going into a like-minded approach. You really need that global discourse, that global dispute, and I think Paul is right. The only way to reach that is by having a global talk, even though that may be kumbaya.
I mean, I don't know. I think that there's a lot of bad things that we see that we don't necessarily have thought of before. That some things have happened that we didn't say, oh, this is going to happen, and we get surprised by it, but it's clearly a bad act by a bad actor. And you can take, in that circumstances, I think you can act. And I think you need to be transparent in acting. You need to communicate why you're acting and why you're doing it. You know, I agree. I'm not saying we shouldn't have those global discussions, but I think we shouldn't wait to have the discussions among close like-minded and then larger group like-minded. And that like-minded group, again, could be more extensive.
Hey, Paul, when people talk about consequences, a lot of times they seem to think it's cyber versus cyber, which is a spy versus spy reference. But we actually have a lot more tools in the kit. Kinetic attack, conventional military response is probably off the table. What would we do other than cyber? I do think we need to have consequences for bad action if we're going to change behavior.
I think that's exactly the place we need to be taking a discussion. What is the full range of actions we can take? And I think if we're talking about deterrence, the first place all of us would probably start is deterrence by denial, making it really hard for threat actors to carry out bad behaviour. The deterrence by, I would prefer the term punishment or deterrence by consequences rather than retaliation, because I think retaliation brings the perspective that you're looking at a tit-for-tat response, and we need to be far more creative with our toolkit. That can range from a whole range of diplomatic activities, and we've seen it in public, people being expelled or pushed back. We've seen statements of concern. In private, the conversations tend to be much more direct, and those are going on quite actively, and I think that's actually a very helpful, useful thing. We're starting to see the beginnings of some thinking around what economic sanctions look like and how you start to put those into place for bad behaviour. There's a whole range of those tools that can be pulled out. I guess the other piece I would say that is going to be quite important in that discussion is the emerging conversation around what collective security really looks like in cyber, because we've had 70 years of that conversation where it comes to conventional threats. We are right at the front edge of what that looks like for cyber, and we saw that with some of the NATO discussions after Estonia's issues back in the mid-noughties. We are yet to work out how that looks, and in a sense that's really one of the places where there's discussion around existing international law applying online, where the rubber hits the road on that, because we actually have to understand what thresholds we're going to hit for applying some of those existing pieces of international law around collective security.
And we want to come back to the question of attribution and evidence, but before we do that, let me ask one for all three. One idea that's been suggested is that you disrupt or slow the bad actors' access to the internet. And the objection to that has been that, well, we don't want to destroy the sanctity of an open, free, global internet. Which one is more important, punishing people or keeping this sanctity of the internet? Do you have any views on that? Karsten, do you want to start, or Chris?
Depends a little bit on how you define the bad actor. Who is the bad actor? If is it a state, or is it proxies, or is it individuals? If you want to really decouple an entire state from the internet, or slow down internet services for an entire state, that's of course a fairly big tool to use. I thought a much more nimble response was actually what happened in response to the DNC hack, when indicators of compromise were made public, which I think did hurt the actual bad actors, but didn't affect the integrity of the system.
I think Jim raised an interesting point. I think you can have both. You want to safeguard your core values, but at the same time you want to have consequences that make a difference and will hold people banned. I agree with Paul. It's not retaliation. It's cost imposition to try to get a bad actor to change their behavior, and that's different under international law as well. So how do we do that? And I think we have to be creative, and not just creative among governments, but talk to people in the private sector, talk to people who do international trade, talk to people who do some of the technical issues. Are there things you can do to restrict people or countries' access, and I'm talking about state actors here, to the benefits that the internet brings, or even the global financial system brings? You don't want to disrupt that system, though, so you have to have a balance. You have to talk to the people about what the positive parts of this are and the negative parts, but that's the creative discussion we haven't had yet, to expand those tools beyond the fairly narrow set of tools we have. And just one comment on attribution. People raise attribution all the time. Attribution is not as huge a problem as I think people say it is. We were able to make attribution in a number of cases, including the Sony Pictures, the North Korea attack. We released a set of indicators recently about North Korean activity. This is something that can be done, especially with prolonged contact, and attribution doesn't have to be 100%. It's a political decision. If it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's a duck. And so you can take action. So I think people who don't, who look at the space often use that as something where you say, well, you can't do anything, and that's a mistake. Because if you don't do anything, then that's a signal to the adversary that everything's okay.
So there have been, I think, some preliminary discussions about what a like-minded approach to imposing consequences on a bad actor would be. And one of the issues that's come up is exactly attribution, which is the US has fairly significant attribution capabilities. And some of our partners say, we're just not going to take your word. So what, Paul, not putting him on the spot because it's not him, how would you come up with standards that would justify collective response? What would those standards look like? What would you need? What would New Zealand need to say, yeah, we're convinced, let's go after them?
Now you are putting me on the spot. And that's great. Look, can I just make one point related to Chris's final point, and that is that not responding is actually highly problematic over time, because at customary international law, that has the consequence of making the activity appear to be a tolerated activity, and that's, over time, something we're going to have to push back on. In terms of responses, I think some of the principles that already apply at international law in terms of how you respond to an attack would apply in a range of other places as well. So it should be proportionate, it should be precisely targeted, it shouldn't involve non-combatants or others in the response. And that I think starts to provide some useful principles right the way through the spectrum of bad activity for how you might respond to it. But I think there's something in there about governments not wanting to take options off the table as well, simply because they might have an impact on the free functioning of bits of the internet over time. And we certainly see that from threat actors. We know of DNS amplification attacks that have taken down large parts of the internet in small states. And we absolutely need to be balancing the ability to prevent that happening with some of those things around precision and care. I guess the key thing I'd say is that the thresholds for that, the accepted practices for that, will only emerge from a really robust set of discussions, both with those with whom we are very like-minded and actually with those with whom we're not, because if you think about deterrence, it's very difficult to deter unless there is at least some overlap of understanding around what acceptable behaviour looks like. And we should work with like-mindeds on the sort of full circle and with others on where the Venn diagram overlaps.
One of the things I like about cyber attack, and that doesn't always come out, is it's very precise. You can specify a particular target, and it's reversible if you choose. So that strikes me as an ideal mechanism for helping people understand the consequences of bad behavior. But we're at the end of our time. What I'd like to do is start with Karsten and go down the row and get people to talk about what do we do now. We're at a transitional moment. We need to think about like-minded global engagement and consequences. Karsten, what do we do?
Just looking at the GGE process, it ain't over till the fat lady sings and she hasn't sung yet. If I may make two remarks, one on attribution. Legally, I agree, every country has the right to do its own attribution, but politically you also have to be able to convince others, and we have a problem there. And on tools, I just wanted to outline, and on responses, I just wanted to outline the European Union recently took an important decision. The European Council agreed to continue working on what they call a cyber toolbox, which outlines a variety of possible responses to malicious cyber actions. So I would encourage everybody to have a look at that. I think it's a quite useful set of instruments that others might also find instructive.
Chris, and quickly because we got to move along.
So I think, as we said in the beginning, I think there are multiple tracks for this, and I actually think the beginning of this conversation with like-minded and building a flexible coalitions to take action is an important thing that really needs to start and start now. And so those are conversations I look forward to having, while at the same time trying to advance the ball in terms of how international law applies, getting more acceptance and norms. None of these are exclusive, but I think we really need to move to that stage of how we work to go against transgressors, to have, really frankly, a more stable and peaceful cyberspace for everyone.
Any final thoughts, Paul?
I think work with what we've already achieved around application of existing international law around norms, and seek to grow that out from the core of organisations and countries that actually buy that as an approach, and accept that at times we're going to trip up and stumble. This is new for many of us, and we've been through that before with security issues where we have to work through things, see what works, see what doesn't, maybe even fail fast at some of it.
So one of the problems we have is that the public discussion of cybersecurity lags behind the political reality. And I hope that next year we can have a similar dialogue, but we'll be in a very different place and talk about process, consequences, norms, and what the right grouping is. With that, please join me in thanking our panel.